politics of inner self. Halfway into the PhD, my research took an unexpected turn, initiated by a character that appeared one day in a session of improvised performance. There she is, in the second video still below that you'll see in a moment. She confronted me in such a way that at certain points in the recording, I become visibly surprised. The performance session itself was unusual. It was the first time I had tried to split myself between two characters and have them converse with one another. This came about as I was considering models of the self that foreground the individual as a kind of plurality, in particular the fragmented and distributed models of self. My art practice does itself not argue for or against these models, but instead aims to make them palpable by staging them for our consideration and providing a means for them to be probed and questioned. At the outset of the performance, I asked myself, if this intimate self of mine were truly understood to be distributed in time and space, if I knew that this was simply how I was built, a material and social collaboration of moving parts and traditions, how would this knowledge change the way I relate to myself? Just as the idea of the distributed self transformed Mrs. Dalloway's view of the finality of corporeal death, I began to wonder whether it could also affect the way I felt about loneliness. In both the fragmented and distributed models of self, there seems to be something less lonely about being alone. In the fragmented model, one can find a friend or foe within one's own singular presence by splitting oneself into many. Within a distributed model, even when entirely alone, one can experience a kind of intimacy with strangers, alive and dead, since the separation between cultural habit and self is collapsed and individual action becomes but a piece of an ongoing communal repertoire. So here is the performance in question, and I called it Politics of Inner Self. You can find it linked below, this conversation that I have with myself in two characters. So in the still above, you see me occupying one character, and in the still below, you see me occupying a different character, and I'll talk to you in a moment about in which way these were different. But essentially, it was the first time I recorded myself switching between two positions and maintaining those two different positions and maintaining a conversation between them. It is longer than my performances usually are. It does last around 40 minutes, and the length was probably enabled by the fact that there was a kind of back and forth between two positions. Whereas when I am playing one character and projecting, I guess I run out of steam. I mean, there's nobody probing me to continue. So these characters are kind of probing each other to continue the conversation. So it lasted a bit longer than usual. So if you're interested in that, this performance is linked below. Thus, I resolved to create a performance experiment in which I would alternately take on two different characters and have a live conversation between them about our relationship, whether or not we compose the same person and the shape of our personal cosmos. These characters would act both as fragments, two different characters within my range of possible expression, and distributed habits, instances of shared communal characters that have survived through time and through many different human beings. Thinking that the conversation might as well be an intellectual one about the predicament of talking to myself in two characters, I decided to stage it as a faux online research event, like a Q&A or two scholars in conversation. To simplify the conditions of this experimental dialogue, I decided that it would be limited to two characters only, and that one of them would be my habitual character, the person I present in everyday life, a bit like the one that you're seeing now. The other one would be someone else, summoned on the spot, using the methods I usually employ in my performances to become otherwise. I had not prepared any questions for the Q&A, nor pre-written or rehearsed any part of the speech, not even in my mind, because I initiated the performance shortly after the idea occurred to me. The conversation was recorded and shared online on YouTube, and below I will recount some key points in the video, including the time codes at which they occur. And I think it's useful to point out this little footnote here, which is saying the online talk, like the sort of academic events, Q&As that were sort of streamed online or that took place on Zoom, was a form which by September 2020, the scholarly community had become accustomed to due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Apart from the fact that I was talking to myself, the home office background of the video and the low-res webcam quality of the image did not look out of place against the backdrop of the type of academic online gatherings that were happening at the time. So it's useful to point out, I suppose, that the aesthetic of this video itself kind of seamlessly blended into the other kinds of academic events that were happening online during the period of the pandemic, apart from the fact that I was talking to myself. So now I'm going to talk you through that conversation, and I'm going to go into it because there are lessons in what happened there that will become relevant to us later on. This is the only empirical experiment that I did that I'm going through with you in the main body of the thesis. The other ones were linked in the description boxes of previous videos, but this one we're going to go through together. So this is what happened in that conversation. Upon hitting the video record button, I, in habitual character, me that you're seeing right now pretty much, began to spontaneously formulate an introduction to the faux research event. And that's me in the still there, being my habitual character. I explained that the premise for the performance experiment would be to conduct a dialogue in which I performed the part of two distinct discussants. After that, the conversation proceeded, in my experience, as organically and co-productively as a conversation between two different people, albeit two people who share the same memories and knowledge. During my introduction, I immediately ran into a couple of problems. The first was a struggle with vocabulary. I found that I did not know what words to use to even describe the two discussants. Was I, in habitual character, a person, and was my conversational partner a fictional character? Were we both characters that made up a whole person? Were we two distinct persons? The problem of coming up with the right labels is a key part of the dynamics that were already unfolding in this conversation before the second speaker had even been introduced. In the video, I decide to dispense with the word person entirely and refer to both myself and the second speaker as characters, which is a policy that I later adopted in the writing of this dissertation too. Following the Q&A convention, the next problem I ran into was how to give a bio of the second discussant. Having been conjured into existence on the spot, they were, after all, nameless, ageless, and had no institutional affiliation or occupation to provide any sort of biographic anchor by which either I or the audience could begin to know them. I deftly evaded the problem by asking the other character how they would like to be introduced, but in so doing, had already begun to offend her. Enter the second character. While speaking in my habitual character, I had been standing to the viewer's left of the microphone. To transition into the second character, I stepped over to the viewer's right side of the microphone, and in that journey of a few seconds, already began to feel different emotionally. When I landed on the other side of the microphone, I took a moment to find the second speaker. As is typical of my self-estrangement process, I needed to utter a few words aloud and enact a few slightly altered behaviours before finding myself in the guise of the second character. The character that emerged, an American with a certain vulnerable strength about her, was likely informed by the attitude and behaviour of certain people I have seen at similar academic events before. Here there is a moment in which the character becomes aware of her own awakening, and like someone who suffers from memory loss, she must gradually find her bearings and recreate the picture of her origins. In so doing, she realizes that she has not in fact simply appeared there and then, but rather that she was already in existence and with me when the idea to have this conversation first came to me some 15 minutes prior. By narrating her own origins, the second character begins to gain a certain mastery over the situation because she has managed to carve out a biography for herself, however short, based on the memory of her own summoning. In fact, she points out, back when I was just beginning to imagine having this conversation, and when I was just beginning to ponder how I could summon an other with whom to speak, she had already begun to feel herself tickled into being. The second character explains that she is having reservations about being involved in this conversation since she was never really asked if she wanted to be a part of it. She also finds being invited to the conversation as my counterpart patronizing. There is then a moment when we encounter a technical problem. The computer recording our conversation has gone into sleep mode, abruptly cutting it off. This occurred while the second character was speaking, so she was also the one who had to fix the problem. Here, a short piece of the encounter is missing, but we can still see the second character fussing around the computer on either side of the missing interval. Throughout the recording, one of the two characters had to periodically move the computer mouse to prevent it from going to sleep, and it is possible to see them each doing this in their own way when their turn comes. The second character recovers herself and explains that she has been invited to the conversation on the condition that she is to be viewed as a deviation from me, the norm. She can only be defined in relation to me, the habitual character, and not as someone in and of herself, like secondary Eve cast out of the rib of primary Adam. Although the two sides of a dichotomy always depend on one another for either of them to come into definition, there is usually a hierarchy between them, where one is the standard and the other the deviation. One is the point, the other the counterpoint. Here, the second character establishes that there is a hierarchy between herself and the habitual character, and that she finds herself in the lesser position of the two. I proceed to apologize for making her feel uncomfortable and try to explain that I had invited her merely because I thought she seemed like somebody who might have something interesting to say about the topic. However, I express that I am not sure what exactly it is I want to learn from her and ask if there is anything she would like to learn from me. The second character appreciates the opportunity to be the one to ask a question. She concedes that she and I seem to form a unity together, but would like to know what it is like to be the dominant expression of a person, the dominant character. Surprised by the question, I remark that, since I've never asked myself this, I must indeed be the dominant character. However, I go on to say that the dominant expression of who we are as a person, the dominant character, itself changes over time, and that I have not always been the one to hold this position. Nor would I be able to say exactly when I became the dominant character. As I speak, I begin to notice that I am struggling a little to maintain my character, even though it is the habitual one, as some of the second character's mannerisms seem to be rubbing off on me. I notice the same is happening to her. Some of my mannerisms are rubbing off on her. I ask her whether she thinks we need to work hard to maintain the distinction between us, or whether we should just let ourselves influence each other. There is indeed some visible blending that occurs when I switch. It can take a moment before the other character comes back. It is interesting that it is my habitual self that is making this point here and not the second character, who is less practiced at being herself. Yet it is true that it takes a while even to remember how to be my more habitual self. The second character responds that it is not so much a question of maintaining our distinctions or affecting difference from one another, but a question of training our conviction in the model of the distributed person for the duration of the experiment. We have to believe that there is such a thing as our two characters within the expressive range of the human being carrying out the performance experiment. Once that happens, we can relax into two very comfortable and spontaneous ways of self-presenting. She explains that she is not acting and that she is not trying to affect difference from the habitual character. Instead, she is trying to search within herself for a being that is just like her, in order to give it expression within the special opportunity provided by the performance. She then likens herself and the habitual character to a phenotype. In genetics, a phenotype is the set of characteristics encoded into the genome that have come into expression in the organism, for example, outward appearance. There are, however, some genes that do not come into expression but remain latent, as with some hereditary illnesses. Likewise, whereas the human being has encoded into its cultural genome a multitude of behavioral patterns inherited from the social milieu, not all of these come into expression. Performance provides a means of bringing into expression latent character codes within the human being that are not encoding the habitual character. According to the second character, this would mean that some characters encoded into the human being come into expression more often than others, that some dominate almost all the time, and that some never get expressed at all. She asks whether this opens up the possibility of a politics of inner self, whereby the distribution of character expression across the human being must be negotiated, often through the implementation of a hierarchy, some characters having access to more expression time over others. Thus, for the first time in my imagination, this character brought to light the ethics of such a politics. Is it right to subdue her in the name of my own self-consistency? In response, I agree that there must be a character hierarchy and politics of inner self at play, resulting in our overall self-presentation as a person, but that for now I'm not yet convinced that it is necessarily unjust that there should be a habitual or dominant, in her terminology, character. Maybe it is a necessary kind of hierarchy, although within sociology, notions of necessary hierarchies have been criticized. To the second character's proposed politics of inner self, I add that where economics is the science of managing scarce resources and where politics is a way of organizing a community around it, there is also a certain notion of scarcity that must be managed in character expression. That is, only one character can be played out at a time. We've seen this a few times so far. Just this fact alone, this scarcity of soul space, creates the conditions for a politics of inner self to emerge. A need, in other words, to manage that soul space and who gets to occupy it. The second character explains that one of the difficulties of her subordinate position as a rarely expressed character is simply remembering herself. Coming into expression as someone who has not had much expressive airtime makes one feel faint, insubstantial, and forgetful. Forgetting themselves and what they were going to say occurs to some extent for both characters throughout the performance.